But in terms of the future, on the one hand, we need to keep supplying Ukrainians with military equipment, and we need to keep providing humanitarian help to the more than 1 million Ukrainians who have now fled into Poland and Hungary and Moldova. On the other hand, I'm sure that foreign ministries and prime ministers' offices around the West are thinking about what gets called in diplomacy off-ramps, what you might say to Putin and to Russian negotiators about things that would stop the conflict, but that would preserve Ukrainian territorial integrity, get the Russians out of the country.
And just on the point that Ines Hobson was saying there about this temporary ceasefire that's been announced in two Ukrainian cities, she doesn't trust a word that comes out of the Russians' mouth, she says. In terms of ceasefires in the past, does she have a good reason not to?
I guess she does, yes. And there's lots of things the Russians have done so far in this conflict that suggest they shouldn't be trusted. Nevertheless, what I hear, that it has been announced and things are happening in those two cities. And it would be part of a Russian strategy, which is they're clearly trying to capture as much as possible of the Ukrainian Black Sea coastline as possible, I think as part of a strategy to try and stop food and fuel coming into Ukraine and to sort of strangle the country. So getting the civilian populations out of those cities, you can see how it would be part of Russian strategy.
And later on, there's going to be, in fact, on Monday, a UN Security Council meeting, another one to discuss exactly this sort of humanitarian crisis and establishing more humanitarian corridors if possible. Is there anything the West can be doing to support this, or is this entirely in the hands of the Russians and they start and stop at their whim?
Yeah. I'm not sure Putin is watching what happens in the UN at all closely, or it matters much to him. I think that the Russians, having not succeeded with a kind of lightning attack in taking major cities, are now involved in an almost medieval strategy of laying siege to these cities and trying to intimidate and even starve the populations out. So you might well see more talk about humanitarian corridors over the next few weeks, initiated by the Russians as part of their military strategy. But in terms of this leading to anything bigger, any sort of ceasefire process or peace process, I'm kind of skeptical, I'm afraid. I wish it were otherwise, but it seems to me that Putin is doubling down on his strategy of trying to take as much of Ukraine as he can. At the moment, it looks like trying to cut the country in half, really along the Dnieper River.
And in terms of what else the West could and should be doing, President Zelensky, as we've been reporting this morning, continues to call for no-fly zones. The Secretary-General of NATO joining other Western leaders in saying that is not going to happen. We're not going to have NATO jets firing at Russian airplanes over the skies of Russia. The Prime Minister this morning has said that with all the threats to nuclear infrastructure in the country, more needs to be done. The West needs to act. Is it clear, if it's not no-fly zones and putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, what actually more action entails?
First of all, on no-fly zones, I understand completely why President Zelensky is so frustrated by this and why the Ukrainian MP you were just speaking to is. But I have to say, first of all, no-fly zones are extraordinarily difficult to implement. Second, once you declare it, you have to enforce it, and that does mean NATO planes engaging with Russian planes. It does mean NATO going to war with Russia, and I just don't think. I don't see any NATO country calling for that, and I don't think it would be the right step. And I don't think there'd be public support for Britain going to war with Russia. However terrible the events in Ukraine. I don't know what the Prime Minister has in mind in terms of what more we can do. I would say that the financial sanctions that have been imposed are having a pretty devastating effect in Russia, and Russia has been cut out of the global financial system, and the ATMs are running out of money, and you can't now exchange your rubles for dollars. And there are people who know their business saying that Russia is going to run out of money quite quickly on this basis. The fact that the Russians are banning social media is not a sign of strength, it's a sign of weakness, that they are worried about the reaction from the Russian population. So it's not inconceivable there's going to be growing public opposition to the war in Ukraine and Russia.
And in terms of the situation that Vladimir Putin finds himself amidst all of that, you've had to think about this when we've had previous issues with Russia in the past when you were National Security Advisor. The Prime Minister telling La Repubblica yesterday that Putin is in a cul-de-sac now. Are you concerned about what Putin might do to try and get himself out of that cul-de-sac? And do you sense the way he's operating is somewhat different to how it was back in 2014 when you were in office?
Yeah, there are 2 points I'd make here. First, I can't see this ending well for Putin. This may take months, even years, but conquering Ukraine or part of Ukraine is difficult enough and proving much more difficult than it seems his military anticipated. But then holding this vast country, imposing some sort of puppet government and holding it indefinitely seems to me a near impossible task if you're talking about a sustained period of time. So I think he is in a cul-de-sac of sorts. In terms of what the West should be doing, I think that back with Crimea in 2014, look, it looks clear now from what we're seeing of Putin's behavior now, that we underreacted, and we should have done more. It should have been a much stronger and sharper reaction in terms of sanctions, so that more of a deterrent you would have hoped for Putin to do what he's doing now. But in terms of the future, on the one hand, we need to keep supplying the Ukrainians with military equipment, and we need to keep providing humanitarian help to the more than 1 million Ukrainians who have now fled into Poland and Hungary and Moldova. On the other hand, I hope that, I'm sure that foreign ministries and prime ministers' offices around the West are thinking about gets called in diplomacy off-ramps, what you might say to Putin and to Russian negotiators about things that would stop the conflict, but that would preserve Ukrainian territorial integrity, get the Russians out of the country, but would enable the Russians to say something to their people about this not having been a completely failed exercise. And there are ideas out there about military, about new treaties, new multilateral treaties about arms in Europe that could enable them to say that they have pushed NATO forces back a bit from Russia's border.